What if everything you were taught about who you are, where you come from, and what your worth was only a partial story? For generations, humanity has been divided by color, labels, and carefully constructed hierarchies. We were taught to see difference first, origin second, yet across ancient scripture, modern biology, and human history, a quieter truth keeps resurfacing. All human life begins from one source, own blood, one origin, one shared beginning. Not separate creations, not higher and lower branches. One human family that diversified over time. Science tells us every human being begins as a single cell, carrying the same fundamental code. Religion echoes the same idea in different languages, creation from one life, spread into many nations and peoples. When these perspectives are placed side by side, a powerful question emerges. If we come from the same source, how did the idea of hierarchy take such deep root? And more importantly, who benefits when people forget that they are connected? This story is not about superiority. It is about memory. It is about identity. It is about understanding how history, belief systems, and selective storytelling can shape how entire generations see themselves and how easily a person can be controlled once they lose sight of their true value. In this video, we are going to explore a perspective that challenges long-standing assumptions, not with anger, not with hatred, but with logic, reflection, and an honest look at ideas that many were never encouraged to question. Some of what you'll hear may feel uncomfortable. That's often where growth begins. If you're here for thoughtful conversations, deeper understanding, and stories that go beyond surface-level narratives, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps this message reach others who are searching for clarity in a world full of noise. Listen closely. Once you see it, you may never see yourself the same way again. When the idea of a single human origin is fully understood, the conversation naturally moves beyond where humanity began and into what that beginning looked like. This is where many stories quietly shift, where interpretation replaces evidence, and where entire generations inherit conclusions without ever seeing the full picture. If humanity truly emerged from one source, then diversity did not appear first. It unfolded later, shaped by time, environment, and adaptation. Variation is not the starting point of the human story, it is the result of it. Across ancient descriptions, early anthropology, and even basic genetic principles, a consistent theme appears. Humanity's earliest expressions were rich, dense, and full of potential. Darkness, in this sense, is not framed as an absence, but as a foundation, an origin state capable of producing range and variation. In biology, complexity often begins with fullness, not scarcity. In art, depth comes before detail. In music, silence gives way to harmony. The same logic is applied here to the human story, not as symbolism, but as structure. Over time, however, this understanding became increasingly uncomfortable for systems built on separation. The story of human origins was simplified, edited, and reorganized in ways that subtly reshaped meaning. Instead of blackness being understood as an original expression of humanity, it was recast as something secondary, something that appeared later, or worse, something that required explanation, correction, or justification. Once that shift occurred, the damage was not only historical but psychological. Identity itself became a question mark rather than a foundation. What is often overlooked is that adaptation does not move backward toward complexity. It moves outward from it. Diversity does not suggest hierarchy, and difference does not imply deviation. Yet narratives were formed that quietly taught entire populations to see themselves as exceptions to humanity rather than representatives of it. When people are taught that they are an afterthought in the human story, they begin to live as though their presence requires permission rather than recognition. This is not simply a matter of race, but of framing. When blackness is positioned as original rather than accidental, the meaning of history changes. It no longer begins in limitation or suffering, but in continuity and resilience. It reframes identity away from reaction and toward inheritance. The question shifts from what happened to us to what was passed down through us. That difference alone alters how a person stands in the world. The power of this perspective lies not in confrontation, but in restoration. It challenges the quiet assumptions that have lived beneath education systems, cultural imagery, and even spiritual teachings. It asks why certain interpretations were elevated while others were dismissed, and why confidence in one's origin has so often been labeled as arrogance rather than self-awareness. When people recognize themselves as part of the source rather than the margins, the need to prove worth begins to dissolve. From that recognition comes a different relationship with history. The past is no longer a chain, but a context. Struggle is not erased, but it is no longer mistaken for origin. The narrative becomes fuller, more accurate, and more humane. Identity stops being reactive and starts becoming grounded. And when that grounding takes place, something subtle but profound happens. Dignity becomes internal rather than negotiated. This understanding does not ask anyone else to be diminished. It does not require comparison, competition, or dominance. It simply restores sequence and meaning to the human story. When blackness is understood as part of humanity's beginning rather than a deviation from it, the story no longer supports ideas of curse or hierarchy. It supports continuity, adaptation, and shared inheritance. And once that truth is placed back into the narrative, it becomes harder to sustain myths that depend on forgetfulness. The story regains its balance, and identity regains its weight, not as a claim over others, but as a return to self. Once identity is no longer viewed as accidental, the way human life is valued begins to change. If humanity comes from one source and carries a shared origin, then life itself is not ordinary, it is entrusted. Within this understanding emerges a powerful idea echoed across spiritual traditions and philosophical thought. Every human being carries an inner essence that is sacred, a spark of something higher that gives life meaning beyond survival. This is not a metaphor designed to elevate a few, but a principle meant to protect everyone. When this idea is taken seriously, it reshapes how we interpret harm. Violence, humiliation, and neglect are no longer seen only as social failures or personal flaws, but as violations against something deeply human. To harm another person is not merely to injure a body or offend a mind. It is to disregard the sacred value that life itself represents. And when that harm is directed inward toward one's own community, damage multiplies, because it strikes at both relationship and reflection. Throughout history, societies that learned to devalue certain lives did not begin with force. They began with belief. Once people were convinced that some lives carried less meaning, harm became easier to justify and harder to recognize as wrong. Over time, this conditioning seeped inward, teaching communities to view one another with suspicion, rivalry, or indifference. The most effective form of control was never constant pressure from outside, but quiet erosion from within. Seen through this lens, internal conflict is not simply disorder. It is a spiritual fracture. When individuals turn against those who share their history, their struggles, and even their reflection, they are not just acting against others, but against the very principle that gives their own life weight. The loss is not one-sided. Something essential is weakened each time dignity is denied. This perspective calls for a different kind of strength, not dominance. But restraint, not reaction, but responsibility. Responsibility. Recognizing the sacred nature of life does not demand perfection. It demands awareness. It asks a simple but demanding question. If life carries divine value, how should it be treated? The answer reshapes everyday choice. How conflict is handled, how anger is expressed, how disagreement is resolved. It does not deny pain or injustice, but it refuses to let pain become permission for destruction. Within community, this understanding becomes transformative. Respect stops being conditional. Human worth is no longer measured by agreement, status, or usefulness. Even disagreement is placed within a boundary of care. When people begin to see each other as carriers of something irreplaceable, cruelty loses its appeal. Violence loses its justification. Indifference loses its comfort. This is not idealism detached from reality. It is realism at its deepest level. Societies do not collapse because people lack resources alone. They collapse when life loses meaning. Reversing that process does not begin with policy or power, but with perception. When individuals learn to recognize value in one another, behavior follows. Protection replaces exploitation. Responsibility replaces impulse. Community begins to function not as a loose association, but as a living system. The idea of divine essence also redefines accountability. If life is sacred, then one's actions matter beyond the moment. Words carry weight. Choices leave residue. Every act either strengthens the space between people or corrodes it. There is no neutral ground. This awareness does not shrink freedom. It deepens it by aligning action with purpose. In this way, honoring the sacred nature of life is not passive or abstract. It is active, disciplined, and demanding. It calls for the courage to restrain harm even when harm feels justified, and the wisdom to see one's reflection in others even when difference is visible. When that mindset takes root, community is no longer held together by fear or force, but by recognition. And in that recognition, something fractured begins to heal. When life is understood as sacred and shared, the meaning of strength begins to change. True power no longer expresses itself through control or intimidation, but through care, responsibility, sovereignty, and restraint. Within this framework, manhood is not measured by dominance, volume, or force, but by the ability to protect what is vulnerable and honor what gives life its continuity. At the center of that responsibility stand women and children, not as symbols, but as living proof of tomorrow. Every human story begins before birth, carried quietly within a woman's body, long before a person speaks, walks, or is recognized by the world. Life is formed through patience, endurance, and unseen labor. This reality alone reshapes the definition of respect. To dishonor women is not simply a moral failure. It is a rejection of the very process that makes life possible. Strength that cannot acknowledge its source is incomplete, no matter how loudly it announces itself. Across cultures and generations, societies that thrived understood this balance instinctively. Protection was not about ownership, but stewardship. A man's worth was reflected in how safe his presence made others feel, especially those who could not yet protect themselves. Children were not burdens to manage, but futures to be guarded. Women were not objects to conquer, but foundations to be honored. When this understanding eroded, instability followed, not because women or children changed, but because responsibility did. In the modern world, confusion has blurred these lines. Aggression is often mistaken for strength, and indifference for independence. Yet the absence of care has never produced freedom. It has only produced distance. When men fail to respect women, communities fracture. When children grow up without protection or guidance, cycles repeat. The cost of neglect is always delayed, but it is never avoided. Recognizing women as the source through which life continues brings accountability back into focus. Life does not simply appear. It is carried, nourished, and delivered through sacrifice that cannot be outsourced. That truth demands humility. It reminds men that continuation is not achieved through force, but through partnership. Even the strongest lineage ends without care, while a protected one multiplies in strength beyond a single lifetime. This perspective also transforms how children are seen. A child is not an interruption of life, but its extension. Every word spoken around them, every example set before them, quietly shapes the future. To protect children is not only to shield them from harm, but to provide an environment where dignity, discipline, and purpose are modeled daily. Strength that cannot guide the next generation is temporary by nature. When men embrace this responsibility, manhood becomes constructive rather than reactive. Conflict is approached with reason instead of impulse. Power is exercised through presence rather than fear. Respect becomes something that flows outward, not something demanded in return. In such environments, women are not forced to carry both life and survival alone, and children grow up seeing stability instead of chaos. This understanding does not diminish men. It completes them. It reconnects strength to purpose and authority to service. A man who honors women honors life itself. A man who protects children invests in a future beyond his own years. These are not abstract ideals, but practical principles that shape households, neighborhoods, and generations. When communities return to this definition of manhood, healing follows naturally. Violence loses its justification. Neglect loses its cover. Responsibility becomes a shared expectation rather than an exception. The cycle of harm slows, not because fear increases, but because respect does. In the end, true manhood is not proven in moments of dominance, but sustained through consistency. It is seen in patience, restraint, and the quiet courage to protect what cannot protect itself. Where women are honored and children are safe, life continues with dignity. And where that dignity is preserved, a community does more than survive, it grows. When the value of life is restored and responsibility is redefined, the question of violence can no longer be avoided. Internal conflict does not appear without context. It grows in spaces where identity has been weakened, dignity has been denied, and frustration has been allowed to replace reason. Yet the message at the heart of this story is clear. Harming one another is not strength, and destruction within a community is never a form of liberation. Violence often disguises itself as power. In moments of anger or fear, it can feel like control, like relief, like release. But that feeling is temporary, and the cost is lasting. Every act of internal harm drains the very foundation that people depend on to survive. What is lost is not only life, but trust, continuity, and the sense of shared future that binds individuals into a people. No community has ever risen by breaking itself apart. The call here is not for denial of pain, but for mastery over it. Self-control is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. The ability to pause, to think, to reason before acting is what separates impulse from purpose. When reaction becomes habit, people surrender their future to the moment. When discipline replaces impulse, direction becomes possible. Unity, in this context, is not blind agreement or forced loyalty. It is recognition. It is the understanding that disagreement does not cancel belonging, and that difference does not justify harm. Unity begins when people see one another not as obstacles, but as extensions of the same struggle and the same hope. That recognition changes how conflict is handled. Words replace weapons. Dialogue replaces destruction. Reason takes the place of rage. The tragedy of internal violence is that it achieves what external pressure could not. It weakens from within. It turns neighborhoods into battlegrounds and brothers into threats. Over time, fear becomes normalized, and loss becomes expected. When that happens, life is no longer defended. It is endured. The message challenges this cycle at its root by asking a simple but demanding question. Who truly benefits when a community destroys itself? Hatred is rarely born in isolation. It is cultivated through neglect, miseducation, and repeated exposure to hopelessness. When people are taught that their lives have limited value, it becomes easier to treat other lives the same way. Breaking that cycle requires more than condemnation. It requires a shift in mindset. Reason must be taught, modeled, and protected as a communal value. The emphasis on reason is not accidental. Reason creates space for growth. It allows pain to be acknowledged without being weaponized. It transforms conflict into an opportunity for understanding rather than escalation. Communities that prioritize reasoning over reaction build resilience. They develop leaders instead of martyrs, builders instead of destroyers. This message also redefines courage. Courage is not found in how quickly someone reacts, but in how carefully they choose not to. It is seen in restraint, in walking away from destruction, even when pride demands engagement. True courage protects life, even when doing so requires humility. Self-destruction, whether physical or emotional, is not rebellion. It is surrender. Every time a person turns their anger inward or against their own, they reinforce the very conditions that created their pain. The message insists that liberation cannot be built on self-inflicted wounds. Healing requires intention, patience, and collective responsibility. When unity, self-control, and reason become guiding principles, the atmosphere begins to change. Safety becomes possible. Trust slowly returns. Children grow up seeing examples of restraint rather than chaos. Disagreements still exist, but they no longer define the outcome. The community begins to move with purpose rather than panic. In the end, the rejection of internal violence is not about image or appearance. It is about survival with dignity. A people who learn to reason with one another instead of destroying one another reclaim control over their future. And in that reclaiming, Strength is no longer measured by force, but by the ability to preserve life and direction at the same time. As this story comes to a close, everything returns to a single, grounded idea. Real power is built, not taken. It does not arrive through noise, conflict, or momentary reaction, but through cooperation, discipline, and intention sustained over time. When people understand who they are, value their lives, and respect one another, the next step is responsibility. Awareness without action changes nothing. Purpose must be translated into structure. Economic cooperation is one of the clearest expressions of that responsibility. When individuals pool resources, skills, and trust, they reduce dependence and increase stability. Money is not just currency. It is direction. Where it flows, attention follows. When communities learn to circulate their resources among themselves, supporting local effort, shared ownership, and long-term planning, they begin to shape their own future instead of waiting for permission to exist within someone else's. Community building follows naturally from that shift. Strong communities are not defined by size, but by connection. They are built when people invest in one another's growth, safety, and well-being. When knowledge is shared, skills are passed down, and opportunities are created internally, the environment changes. Hope becomes practical instead of theoretical. Progress becomes visible rather than promised. Health, both physical and mental, is another pillar of real liberation. A disciplined body supports a focused mind, and a focused mind makes wiser choices. Caring for the body is not vanity. It is maintenance. Life demands energy, clarity, and endurance. When people neglect their health, they weaken their capacity to build, protect, and lead. Strength begins within, long before it shows outward results. Collective discipline ties these elements together. Discipline is not punishment. It is alignment. It is the shared agreement to act with purpose rather than impulse, to think long-term rather than react short-term. When discipline becomes communal, standards rise naturally. Accountability is no longer enforced through fear, but upheld through respect. People begin to expect more from themselves and from one another. This is the path to liberation that does not depend on approval, conflict, or confrontation. It is quiet, steady, and difficult to stop because it is rooted in self-direction. When communities become economically aware, socially connected, physically strong, and mentally disciplined, power no longer needs to announce itself. It is visible in stability, growth, and confidence. Before we part, thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and engage with this message. Conversations like this matter because they plant seeds, and seeds grow when they are revisited and shared. If this story challenged you, inspired you, or offered a new perspective, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep thoughtful conversations alive and reaching those who need them. Stay grounded, stay disciplined, stay connected, and remember, real power begins when people choose to build together. Power begins when people choose to build together.